welcome.
Yeah. Okay. Technical difficulties. Okay, I think I've got it squared away.
So Representative Fusco, we just went over some of the just technical ground rules as far as to keep things streamlined for communication and translation. Interpreters, easier on the interpreters. Then we're going to just ask people to talk, to raise their hands, speak one at a time, and we will call on them.
Yes, perfect. Are they familiar with the raise hand feature and how to access that I think it's in participants. I think it's in.
No, it's in reactions.
Reactions. Yes. Okay. Good deal. Okay, so should we get started?
I think we're all here.
We're all kind of started already. All right. Well, good morning. Our interpreters, I'm assuming, are ready to go.
Yes, sir, we are.
Thank you. Now, please call me John. No sirs here today. Just a reminder, Representative Abercrombie is not with us this week, and nor is Luisa Soboleski. She also had to go out of town, so they're not with us this week. But we do have Heather Ferguson is up there. I see her, so that's good. She's a glue that holds us all together. And I also want to acknowledge Christina Penn, who is our Finance Committee clerk, who has offered to help us and provide administrative support. So thank you very much to Christina. She's doing a great job. Looking to see if we have any additional folks this morning. If we do, welcome, and remember to just stay muted during the meeting. Thank you. I guess with that, Representative Comey, you have any opening remarks that I may have additional or some that I may have missed, or perhaps?
I think we're all set. We're looking forward to getting to the business at hand. Thank you.
Excellent. So just real quickly, just a reminder of today's meeting, we are going to address interpreter standards. And the goal of that is so that we can get the information we need to perhaps craft some legislation for the upcoming session. I think the interpreter standards is very important. We've determined it to be a foundational issue. And so the goal today is to hear all of your concerns and get all of your input so that we can put that together and hopefully craft that legislation, before February comes. And a reminder to everyone that this is going to go by pretty quickly. We only have 4 meetings. This is the standards one. This is where we need to get all that stuff done. So it's important that we remain focused and stay on task. And I think we'll probably do a lot of listening rather than a lot of talking. Did everyone, maybe by a raise of hands, receive the proposed legislation amendments to 46A33, which is the standards? Everyone get a chance to review that? I just got to get my caption up here. Yes, everyone get that? Raise of hands. Yes, Harvey, Kim.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. All right, great. So I guess, would you like to, I guess we can start probably with for Harvey, since he has his hand up. I'm not sure how we want to go about this, Robin. Maybe you have some input. You want to perhaps address those proposed amendments? I don't know if they're stale at this point. Maybe we'll go and just see the group, since we have a small group this morning, I think, on how they feel about that legislation, those proposed amendments. Let me get my gallery view up here first. Okay, there we go. Yes, we do have plenty of people here. So good morning, everyone.
And the other thing, Representative, that we have is the presenter, Mary Sue Owens.
That's right.
And I'm not sure if we want to do that. I don't know how they work together.
I think we have let Mary Sue go ahead and present first. I think that's probably in the best interest in the meeting going forward. Mary Sue, I got to look around. I've got to look around and find you on the screen here. There you are.
Actually,
You're with us. You're lit up. Yes.
thank you. Good morning. Actually, I'm not really here to present anything. I've already spoken with the subcommittee, Harvey, Louisa, Barbara, Sandy. And I'm really here to answer any questions. I guess probably my notoriety is the fact that I'm probably the longest standing interpreter in Connecticut. So I've been through all iterations of what's happened before the law and for the passage of the law. So I think that that's why Harvey and the group wanted me to be here, is to answer any questions about, you know, any of the changes that have occurred over the year.
All right, great. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Art, would you like to begin?
Okay, yes. Thank you and good morning, everybody. I am part of the committee that has sent this document to all of you, to the working group members for review and for a good discussion and dialogue. Now, first of all, there are two parts to this document, and I explained that in the email to all of you. The first part is the current legislation that is written. We have suggested some amendments to that. And all of those amendments will be shown in red letters. And it's just improvement to some of the language in areas that need to be adjusted. The second part of this document is an entirely new section, which is section number 2. And this talks about the establishment of the Interpreter Standards Board. And so there are different parts to discuss, especially the appointment of any Interpreter Standard Board members, participant responsibilities, terms of office, and then areas of responsibility regarding certifications and that process. Certain areas of settings that the interpreter is considered competent and qualified to do. And so this will be more of a evolvement of the interpreter standards. So taking into consideration what different states do, what national organizations do, especially the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, RID. And so this is just a way of setting up a mechanism of how we can handle all of the involvements that have happened. We currently do not have a mechanism in place with the legislation as written. So we would like to make this amendment, have it go through the legislative process so that we do have this mechanism in place for ongoing evolution of the interpreter standards. That way we have a procedure established that can address any concerns for individuals that potentially want to file a complaint, because right now there is no place to go in the state in order to do so. So we would like to establish those procedures. In this document, it does spell out some of the violations which will be reported to the Professional National Organization, as mentioned earlier, RID, in situations as needed. So that is just a brief of kind of how we've established those two parts of the document. One is the current legislation with amendments shown in red, and then an entire new section called Section 2, establishment of the Interpreter Standard Board. So I do appreciate greatly that Mary Sue is here today to answer any questions and to be here as part of our dialogue as needed for clarification or for additional information. Please feel free to ask any of the other members of this group that have been a part of this proposal. I am not the only one that is here for a clarification or information. We are hoping to have a really good dialogue today. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Harvey. So I guess the most important thing for me, since the interpreter standards are so important as we move forward with education, workforce, and then into the mental health meetings that we're going to be having coming forward. I think it's imperative that we remain focused on your concerns for at least for the time being on the interpreter standards, and that's the reason why we're here today. So I want to make sure that all of your concerns are heard today regarding the standards, because if we don't have the good standards in place, then the education piece kind of falls apart. And you are the people that have the information. You have my, not only my undivided attention, but my ultimate faith. You are the folks that have this information. And Representative Comey and I, Representative Abercrombie and I, we're the ones that have the ability to get that legislation crafted and try to get it across the line in February. So any concerns that you have, any changes, any concern, anything you want to do with interpreter standards, today is a day to get that out. And I think that's going to be, it's going to be a heavy lift, depending. Harvey, do you propose any additional changes to the amendments that I see before me in this sheet that you offered?
So, yes, I would probably like to just assist in this process as we begin this discussion and propose some changes within the current legislation. So in a quick get together, if that's all right with you all, if we could look at page 1. Page 1 and number 1, if we could look at that. Now, this mentions in the old language, the Department of Rehabilitation Services. Even though this is current law, it's mentioning an older name, Department of Rehab Services. So we just want to update that and make sure that it is Aging and Disability Services, which is the current name of the agency. So everyone following so far? All right. Okay. So I'm going to move on to the next proposed change. The next item is number 3, as well as number 2. So I guess let's do 2 and 3. Upon the request of the deafblind community here in the area, we want to do a minor change. Instead of deaf/blind, they are just called deafblind together. So we would like to eliminate that dash in between. And then also on the first page, it is in lowercase. Now on number 3, very similar, it's just how we spell deafblind. So just a minor change here. The concept is the same as before. It is the deaf-blind community. It is just not recognized as deaf-blind. Okay, and just for interpreter clarification, depending on how you're using it in the language, sometimes it is a capital D, capital B within the word deafblind. Sometimes it is lowercase letters. If it is requiring the capitals, it would be both capital D and capital B, even though the word is combined.
Mary Sue?
Yes, just as a point of clarification, generally when we're talking about the condition, okay, I don't see someone signing, I'm sorry. There we go. Okay. Yes, as a point of clarification, usually when you're talking about a condition of being deafblind, that's when it's in lowercase. But when you're talking about a member of the community, that's the way they prefer to be identified. And that's why it's capitalized that way. Capital D, capital B as one word. So that's how it differentiates.
Understood. Thank you.
Okay, so if there are no more questions regarding that, I will move forward. And we'll go to number 4. We are recommending to put in a new section called community interpreting, because unfortunately this is absent from the present law. We feel that this is a vital section, and we would title it community interpreting. I would say it is, I mean, honestly, the majority of the interpreting done, as well as other settings. You have the mental health setting, the educational setting, the legal setting. So those are examples of different settings. Community interpreting is a broad range of various settings. And so that is what we would consider majority of the interpreting. And we want to make sure that this is not an overlooked omission and that it is included in the present language. Any questions regarding that?
I'm here.
I see that Susan Yankee has her hand
I'm
raised.
sorry, Susan. Thank you for helping me with that. Yeah.
Hi, this is Susan Yankee. Harvey, I agree. This is extremely important. I just want to make sure with community setting, are you now?
I'm sorry to
Sorry.
interrupt. One moment, please. Okay. You can go ahead now. Thank you.
Thank you. Harvey, I agree. This is extremely important. But I just want to clarify, community setting, are you now including nonprofits and other activities that might not have the funding to have a registered interpreter? Only reason I'm asking is I know of groups that CRID has a program where you can get a volunteer interpreter, and but that is only if someone's available. Is there any way that there could be a funding set aside for nonprofits so that they can, because a lot of them don't have interpreters in the budget, have some way that they can afford? So if they're going to have a community or civic event and someone needs an interpreter, or in addition, is there a way to educate this section, the community, that now if they have an interpreter, they need to be of this interpreting standards law? Because I know educational settings and legal and medical will be getting notices once this law is passed, but how are we going to reach the community, different community groups, and let them know that this law has been passed and now this is something that they have to include in their budget?
Yes, you have brought up a very good point for all of us to consider and discuss today. I would like to ask Mary Sue for her experience in the many years that she has worked in interpreting in the various settings. So Mary Sue, would you mind responding to this?
Thank you, Harvey. I'll wait till the interpreter gets on. Okay.
And this is interpreter real quick. If you don't mind, let's just go ahead and leave both interpreters pinned, because we will be switching often. And I think that would help with the speed of the meeting.
I absolutely can do that.
Thank you, Heather.
First of all, thank you, Susan, because you bring up an excellent point. It's been a long-standing issue. First of all, if if a agency or a nonprofit, whatever, it doesn't matter that they have nonprofit status. Some nonprofits still are required under the Americans with Disabilities Act for providing interpreting services, for providing access. So that's really what we need to look at. Again, that points to the problem of not having anybody to monitor whether or not the services that are being provided appropriately, or if they're not even being provided at all. So that is certainly an issue. The current law, and even with some of the suggested changes that the committee had brought up, includes at the bottom, you'll see where it says, I forget the exactly which section, but it talks about if you're not being paid, then you're not obligated to follow these standards. And while many of us, especially those of us who are professional interpreters, are a little disappointed at that, we recognize that there are groups and agencies. For example, there are churches who feel that they just don't have the financial ability to provide for paid professional interpreters. And so in that case, you often will see someone in the community who volunteers their services. They may be certified, they may not, they may be registered, they may be not. But basically what this section is talking about, who is required to register in Connecticut. And if you are one of those that provides interpreting services without being paid, you're not required to register. That does not take the onus off of the agency or organization that is responsible for providing the services. If under ADA they're required, they need to be providing services that are in line with the Americans with Disabilities Act and with this law. If you're paying for it, you need to make sure that they're registered. If they're registered, they need to be certified. I don't know if that helps. Please let me know if I need to clarify any further.
No, that's wonderful. But those nonprofits that are required by ADA, somehow we're going to have to find a way to make sure they are educated to the new standards, because I feel like they will be left out of the information when it's given out when the law's passed.
Exactly. And that is something that used to exist many years ago when we had the Commission on the Deaf. They were responsible. They were the responsible agency, and they did provide that education across the board. Throughout the years, as those services got cut and everything became under the Aging and Disability Services, we no longer see that broad category of education. And that is one of the things that in the establishment of the monitoring board, and I'll let Harvey and the group speak to that in more detail, that is one of the things they would like to see the monitoring board take on, is making sure that that education gets out there. Because you're right, if people don't understand and they don't know, they're not going to be providing the appropriate access.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Mary Sue.
Okay, thank you very much, Mary Sue. Another thing that comes into picture here is the language for any religious interpreting settings. We follow the concept of the separation of state and church. So we are not going into the area of religious interpreting. There are many good, skilled interpreters within the religious settings, but we are not going to establish any type of legislation or rules in regards to religious setting procedures, because we do want to maintain that American constitutional mentality of separation of church and state. If there are no further questions, we can move on. And if we want to look at now a renumbered section, since we added the community interpreting section, we are renumbering things. Let me see here. We are now going to 7 and 8. Now we are trying to differentiate between medical setting and mental health setting, the services provided for those two. Despite the fact that they are very similar, medical is the broader category of the two. There are a lot of people that prefer just to work within the medical setting, and other interpreters are very willing and specialized to work in the mental health setting. That is why we are proposing the separation of the two, because there is increased awareness of the needs for appropriate mental health services. And that has been for a few recent years. We have seen more of a need within that specialized area of mental health service provisions. So those interpreters who are becoming skilled within mental health settings are also somewhat in the medical setting, but are more specialized and have certain certifications that can display medical skill versus mental health skill. So I believe that's going to help with the list of categories, let's say, that we are going to be posting on the website. So that explains why we have number 7 and number 8 is the differentiation between those two, the clarification of medical and what is included in that, which is the renumbered 7 section. And then we have number 8, which is mental health, similar language, but addresses solely mental health. Any questions regarding that? Okay, I don't see any. If none, then we can move on. Now moving to
Yes,
number 9.
sorry, excuse me. Miss Andrew Norton has got his
Oh, there you go.
Thank you.
waving.
Mr. Chair, is it appropriate for me to ask a question at this moment?
Yeah, of course, sure.
Thank you. I couldn't find the raise your hand thing fast enough, so I just raised my hand, but thank you.
Andrew, could you turn your camera on so I can highlight you, please?
Looks like it's on.
His camera is on.
You can see me.
Yeah, we've got him. I've got it.
I had a question, Harvey, and by the way, thank you for all this work. From the point of view of statutory simplicity, I've read this a couple of times and I don't see any difference in the qualifications for medical interpreting and mental health interpreting. Am I wrong? Is there a difference in these 8 or 7, 8? There's 8 credentials for all of these, including legal. And I see one difference between legal and medical, and that is in legal, you need a level 5 certification from NAD. In the others, you need a level 4. But between mental health and medical, I don't see any difference. I heard you say you wanted to keep these two separate, but am I right in seeing no difference in the 8 credentials that can get you to medical or mental health interpreting?
Now, Andrew, I would like to ask Mary Sue at this time to go ahead and respond to this. It is a very good question. Mary Sue?
Yes, thank you, Harvey. You're correct, Andrew. At this point, the required credentials are the same. The hope is on a national level that there will be more specialization, because there are individuals who get additional training in different specialties. And at some point, we would hope that people who would like to do more mental health interpreting would get more more trainings. And it's not a difference in certification at this point. There used to be, for example, there was a specialist certificate for legal. That test no longer is provided. And so people are not able to even sit for that test. There are very few of us in this country who have that certificate. And we know that we can't limit the availability of interpreters in those settings. So we've had to broaden the what is acceptable so that we can allow other people who may not have been able to sit for that special exam, but who have garnered the training and the necessary skills and education to be able to provide the appropriate interpreting service. The hope is, as we continue to evolve, that we will do the same for medical and we will do the same for mental health. And so that's the reason for separating it in this language. Is it's a hopeful idea that, you know, down the road we'll actually have those specialist certifications so that we can be, you know, even more assured that the people providing those interpreting skills are actually having the appropriate skills and training to do that work. So it's sort of we're looking forward to the future when that's actually happening. So we don't have it right now, but you are correct that the requirements are the same for medical and mental health.
Okay. And I have another question. I don't know if it's timely right now, but in this law as proposed, if it became law, there are 3 categories of settings where there are credentials established: medical, legal, and mental health. Let me just make sure I'm getting that right. And whereas the law later on, when it talks about the Interpreting Standards Board, and in the definitions section, mentions not only mental health, medical, and legal, it mentions community, which is new. That's a new category added in with the red language. And I think somewhere it mentions, and it already does mention educational. So the law right now it says educational settings, legal settings, and medical settings. But we do not establish credentials in law for educational settings. We just define them without a follow-up separate credential requirement. Now we're adding mental health and community. But in the case of educational, it will still be the case. And in the case of community, it will be the case that there aren't credentials established lower down in the statute for what it means to interpret in a community or educational setting. Is that intentional, or did you think that would be too complicated to undertake? I was hoping to ask that. That's my question.
I'll let Harvey. Harvey, did you want me to respond to that?
Okay, so this is Harvey, and I do believe, now looking through this, I do believe that on page 1 and also a little bit on page 2, there is that definition of what those settings are. And the credential part is later on another page. So Andrew, if you can maybe wait until we get to that other page, we can discuss credentials at that time and how we want to handle that in the language.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, now, are there any more questions? If not, we will move forward to number 9.
Just real briefly, hold on, before we move forward, I just want to address Mary Sue. You're still with us. Yes, okay, thanks for coming back, I appreciate that. Just real quickly, so you mentioned that there's been a broadening to some regard as far as allowing interpreters who might not have the certification in legal settings. And I must say that, you know, you kind of, you don't have much choice really, right? You're kind of stuck in that place.
Right.
To your knowledge, has there been, what's the feedback been from that? You know, I need to understand, you know, if this is a real serious concern, if it's, you know, I just want to get a gist of where we're at with that, you know, or what would take place in the event, you know, we had an individual. I guess I guess it goes to Alvin. I guess if someone went to a legal setting and they didn't have, proper representation in that setting, or they weren't qualified, I guess that call would go out to Alvin, as I understand it today. And he, we could probably move forward for that. But since he's new, hasn't received those calls, and I'm certainly new at this, what are we doing? How do we identify those issues? And is it a big problem?
Well, first of all, from the court perspective, it's not really a problem because they have worked hand in hand with the source agency and a few others to make sure that on their list, they know exactly who is eligible to interpret in the legal setting. So, for example, if they contract with Source or they contract with Cosign or maybe another agency, the onus is on those agencies to only send interpreters that they know are qualified to do the work. So the court has given them that responsibility. Now, the problem comes in police situations or in attorneys hiring people to do depositions. We do not see that occurring. And they don't know who has the appropriate qualifications. Fortunately, if they contact an agency such as Source, such as Cosign, then those agencies, because they do work with the court system, I think LifeBridge is another one, because they do work with the court systems, they're very familiar with who is on their staff that can do that work, and they will send the appropriate individual. But if an attorney or a police station or whomever calls and they get any of the multitude of agencies that are providing interpreting services in Connecticut, they have no idea what they're getting because they are trusting that the agency is going to send somebody, but the agencies themselves do not know who is qualified and who is not qualified. And I want to address that just briefly, that even though the credentials that are outlined currently in the standards are considered the highest level credentials, it still doesn't mean that that person has legal training. And that's why it's really important that the agencies that are providing interpreting services know and are able to evaluate their staff to ensure that their interpreters that they're sending are appropriate in those individual settings.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Jim.
Good morning, and thank you, Representative Fusco and Representative Comey. Jim Acabellas from the Connecticut Hospital Association. I don't have a question. I just have something that I have jotted a note down as we go through this process to make sure. I think the distinction for a medical setting and a mental health setting in some cases will be very clear if you are going into a provider office for a counseling session, a substance abuse session. I think that is really clear, and there are some clear settings when it is simply medical, in that you've twisted your ankle. But there are times I think are going to need to watch to make sure that as we deal with sort of the accountability section of an interpreter being qualified, that if you have an interpreter in a medical setting and there are mental health issues that come up, how are those going to work out in those settings where you both have a medical and a mental health? I don't have an answer right now, but it's one of the things that I am thinking through as we go through this, because I think Harvey is doing a terrific job of explaining everything, and it's bringing some issues to mind, but I wanted to bring that forward. How do we deal with in a setting, whether it's a doctor's office, an FQHC, a clinic, where you come in for a medical, you have a medical interpreter that shows up, but whether it's me or an elderly patient that comes in, the mental health issues become roaring to the forefront. So I just wanted to bring that up as we begin to talk this through.
Thank you for that, Jim. I appreciate it. And that is the job of these chairs when we craft this language, put that together, make that proposal and bring it back to this group for review before we get it to the proper committee in the next session. So thank you for that. Mary Sue.
Yes, I just wanted to address that briefly, that in most situations, from my experience, when the initial issue is a medical issue and the medical interpreter goes to that assignment, if it becomes apparent that it is involving something related to mental health or legal, because we've been called to, let's say, a hospital emergency room, and we may have a rape victim. So you may need somebody who has mental health experience, may need someone who has experience legally, because they're going to be interviewed by the police. So in those situations, it's incumbent on us, per our code of professional conduct, that if we are not an appropriate interpreter in that setting, we must inform the people there and then contact our agency to make sure that the appropriate interpreter is sent. So again, that we hope that all of the interpreters that we are using here in Connecticut do follow that code of professional conduct and realize when they are out of their league.
Point well taken. Thank you, Mary Sue.
Mhm.
Okay, Harry, I think you're into number 8 here, perhaps. Still in number 8. You have some, or are we on to number 9 and so forth?
Number 9. So we changed that section to say deafblind, one word, spelled one word instead of having the hyphen, okay? And the rationale for that was actually addressed in a previous explanation, correct? All right, now we'll move on to page 3. There are no proposed changes on page 3. Page 4. So right now we're working, and it's been accepted with a previous legislation. We would like to add the approved certification for a deaf interpreter as certified in Massachusetts. And we have to spell out the fact that that certification includes sections that are not mentioned yet in our document. So that is a requirement, and we do realize from experience, it's been a couple of years now, that some of those sections and some of those requirements have already been approved under the previous legislation. So we're looking at page 3 actually leads into page 4 with the same paragraph D, and it's the last part. You will see it written in red, relating to certification standard number 8 that has been approved in Massachusetts for a deaf interpreter for deaf and hard of hearing individuals. So now we're looking at point E, talking specifically about mental health as it differs from the medical environment mentioned in point D. So the requirements in E for a mental health setting will include number 8. It's called deaf interpreters credentials from Massachusetts Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. And again, the requirements are the same as mentioned before for the mental health setting. And as Mary Sue mentioned in the previous discussion, it will actually spell out, hopefully in the future, we will have more specifics for mental health And as we evolve with this legislation, we hope that in the future that will be addressed. However, everything that we've put forward, we hope that we will maintain moving forward in the evolution of this legislation in the area of mental health settings. So this is point E. So again, it's basically the same as the interpreting in a medical environment. Now we're moving on to F.
Hold on a second, before we move on here, let me ask you a question. Harvey, I apologize, Harvey. So, for the, and I'm assuming that the advisory board is still okay with utilizing these folks from Massachusetts, correct? Obviously, rhetorical question, but want to make sure.
Yes, that is correct. That is also my understanding.
And this is not specific.
We understand that we need more interpreters here in Connecticut. So by accepting certification from the Massachusetts Commission, that expands the pool of interpreters working here and providing services here in the state of Connecticut.
Do we have any way of knowing what the utilization is of Massachusetts certified interpreters? Is there a lot of that? Are we using a lot of them? Is it a is it a few? Is it, how can we track that?
So, okay, I am not in possession of this specific data. Perhaps Alvin Shagay is more aware of that. Is there any data available, Alvin? I don't have specific data on that, but I'm responsible of the interpreter registry here in Connecticut. And some of the interpreting agencies, for example, Source Interpreting, this is one of the agencies, others as well, like Cosign, I know that they have some of their interpreters on roster who come from Massachusetts or have that certification. And I think there would be a better resource to look into this issue and get the appropriate data from them.
Okay, so obviously they're on the registry with the state, these individuals. Is it the?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you. Jeff Braven.
Yes, so I can also confirm that any RID certifications which have currently been put on a memorandum are on a moratorium. Massachusetts certification is also similar. It is currently in process of being revised. So I know that we have a few interpreters with that type of certification that we do utilize because they've had that longstanding.
Thank you.
Okay, Harvey speaking. Should we move
Yes,
on?
I would have Harvey move on.
All right. Okay, the next. Okay, for the interpreter, okay, okay. Okay, so for point G, it's really a reiteration, but there's no changes. And so we can move on to point I. There's again, no changes in the language for this legislation. Now we're moving on to page 6. And this is J. There's one proposed change. And again, it refers to the spelling of deaf blind. That's all for point J. And this is something that we've addressed before, so it will stay the same, spelling deaf blind in one word. Okay, so on page 6, the law that stays the same on the books and the way it was written before, the same language relates to the rights of deaf and hard of hearing here in Connecticut. And again, this is not the mandate for them to provide services. And we're trying to see how we can provide a situation, how we can improve the situation. I apologize. So we have some of these issues covered under the new section 2. So now in section J, we remove the old language and the new language will appear in K. As we discussed before, there were some complaints and complaints relating specifically to interpreting. And we've had that conversation before at a previous meeting, but really the interpreting agencies are really the ones responsible for addressing these, because these are the entities sending interpreters out to provide the services. So we thought maybe to change the language and help the business entity / agency who provides the interpreting services to include for interpreters who are in state or out of state, and who provide services here in Connecticut. So they will promise that the interpreters they send out to provide services will actually be on the same lines and as the standards, interpreting standards that we mentioned in section 2. Okay, because there was a confusion as far as who is responsible for the interpreters sent out and the qualifications, and this will go back to the agencies who receive the request for interpreting services. Okay. And that goes again back to the agency. So this is the rationale for us to discuss, the responsibilities of who send the interpreter to provide interpreting services in the hospitals or other settings. The agencies know the roster of interpreters and their certifications and their expertise in a specific setting, and they're the ones who provide the interpreters. So they have to ensure the quality of interpreting services when they send on an interpreter to a specific site. I want to make sure that this is clear. Are there any questions?
Yeah, it is clear, but you use the word promise. That always gives me some concern, right? That the entity promises to send interpreters who quite frankly know what they're doing. Again, this goes back to how many interpreters from out of state that we're using. Would be important to kind of corral this in to understand what the scope is. Harvey, you want to say something?
Yes. Excuse me. Okay, I apologize. I want to make sure that what I meant was assure, not a promise, but assure. Okay. Because that's the wording in this specific language for this.
Well, it's my hope that we can keep moving forward to where we don't really need interpreters from another state. Because when we talk about additional states, I must assume we're talking about Rhode Island, perhaps, I guess New York, perhaps Pennsylvania, places that are close where they can actually send people here in a timely manner. So in the meantime, is it my understanding that we've agreed to accept the criteria by which people can become interpreters in Massachusetts, so that they can send them here, and that the entity itself is responsible. Because if I need someone, I'm going to reach out to the entity, right? Not the individual. So so our business is kind of with those entities. So are those entities, would you like to see them registered in the state, or would you like to see the individuals registered in the state? Because quite frankly, if we're not utilizing it, and I don't know to what capacity we're utilizing it, but if it is a small capacity, maybe we look at making sure that those folks are certified, that they meet, the criteria that we have here in our state. I understand that we're approving the entities from Massachusetts and where they get their qualifications, but perhaps this group, because I know they're very specific about, about the qualifications, we can have them qualified here as well, from a standing agency that it's approved.
Okay. So it's a good question, but and I'm happy to answer that, but I believe that we will have our expert in this domain actually comment on this and answer your question.
It's nice to be called an expert when all you have to do is get older. Anyway, basically what we're talking about is that the interpreters, for the most part, our interpreters do come from the Connecticut area. We may have some from New York, some from Massachusetts, some from Rhode Island, but primarily they're in this region. The good thing is they are required to be registered, period. They're required to be registered in Connecticut. So that's certainly something we have we should be proud of, that we do require that. The problem is that the agencies that are being utilized are not all in Connecticut. They are across the country. Literally, there may be some in California, Maryland, DC, Texas. And as the interpreters here can attest to, we get calls and emails from all over the country asking us to sign on with their agency to provide interpreting services in Connecticut. Part of the problem is they have no way of verifying the quality of the interpreter skills because they're not local. They will look at registration. They may say, okay, per Connecticut's current law, this person meets the standards set forth in the law. And that may be true. But again, those are minimum standards. It doesn't mean that that person's skills necessarily rise to the level needed in that given situation. So previously, the onus was on the interpreter to make sure that the interpreter was qualified. And again, I go back to, we do have a code of professional conduct that we are supposed to say, I'm not qualified for this setting. I need to step out. They need to send someone else who is more qualified. But we'll be honest, there are people who sometimes don't realize they're in over their head. And there are others who need a paycheck. And they're going to do the best they can and think that they are able to provide an adequate level of service. The work group in this discussion said, you know what, there really needs to be some responsibility on the part of the agencies, because here in Connecticut, the agencies that we work closely with, primarily Source and Cosign, I believe Partners is another one. They make sure that their interpreters are qualified to do the work that they are sent to do. They do take on that responsibility. And if an individual, an organization that hires that agency, contracts with that agency, or a consumer that contracts, says, you know what, that interpreter, no, don't send them the next time because they really weren't able to do the work. They can go back to that agency, and that agency, for the most part, I believe, from our experience, those local agencies will listen to them because they're more closely aligned with the deaf community, and they know who the individuals are in the community. It's the out-of-state agencies that have nothing to do with Connecticut except for providing a service and collecting income, but they have no one to be accountable to. And I believe that was the focus of the work group, is that those agencies need to understand that they are responsible for the interpreters that they send to do the job. And if they're sending interpreters that aren't qualified or up to snuff, they need to be aware of that. So it's an evolution. It's a realization of, who really has the power to make some of these decisions, and they do then need to be accountable for it. I apologize for my dogs.
No, thank you. That's an important aspect. And before I get to Marlene, I'm gonna ask that question. Because I want everyone to remember that, we're a team here, right? We're a group together. This isn't really a Q&A. It's a Q&A just for the purposes of getting information, right, for the chairs. But my question to the group as a whole is, how do you propose, give Representative Comey and I some proposals on how you think what the corrective action should be, what the appropriate action should be to protect, our residents who are in need of those services. That goes to everyone, goes to Barbara, and goes to Jeff and Harvey, et cetera, et cetera. So please think about that for a minute. And I'm going to go to Marlene, and then I'll get back to that question and see if we can get some input. But Marlene, hello. You have your hand raised.
Sorry. Oh, sorry. You can hear me now?
Yes. Could I get you to move your camera down so we can see more of you?
Oh, okay. All right. My name is
For the
Molly
interpreter.
from the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. I have two questions. One relates to staff interpreters that we have, who have been working for many, many years with the department. So I would like to know where do they stand in terms of specific certification. That's one. And two, as a clinician that I know that in the ER, sometimes that cases come and go and you really do not understand the significance of it, or being able to assess whether the person is legal or psychiatric or anything like that. So in emergency situation, do we have exception for interpreters? For instance, in emergency situation, as we have we make for certain other cases, because in emergency is maybe very difficult to have a specific certified interpreter. So that's two issues.
Marlene, I'm going to be, Harvey, would you like to respond?
I'll let Mary Sue respond.
Yes, that's what Harvey was going to say.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you, Marlene. You bring up a very good point. First of all, yes, the interpreters that work currently in the mental health under DEMIS have been there for many years. I would assume that all of them are currently in compliance with the standards that as they are set now. I would seriously doubt that there would be a change that would prompt any of them to need to let go. I just don't see that happening because their years of experience in and of itself should qualify for that. Now, speaking to the situation, as you suggested, sometimes what starts out as a mental health situation can lead into a legal situation. I want to say again, as interpreters, we need to know what our limits are, and we need to understand the impact that we have on a situation. So for example, if I'm interpreting for a mental health client and that individual discloses something and the counselor realizes I need to bring in the authorities. And this is because this obviously leads to legal. As an interpreter, if I don't have that legal expertise, I need to make sure that someone else who has that expertise is brought in, because the fact that I may not have that and I am put into a situation of interpreting something that may become foundational evidence for a future charge towards a perpetrator. If I'm not qualified to do that work, that could in and of itself distort that case and maybe make it possible that that case can't go forward. Right. So I know that we have worked very long and very hard, especially for children who have been abused, to make sure that we always bring in the appropriate interpreters, because that is a devastating experience. You don't want the child to have to be interviewed over and over and over again. If I realize in that situation, and it doesn't really matter what age, because if it's a traumatic experience, you don't want them to have to relive it by having to tell that story over and over again. So if I am not qualified, I should be stepping out and I should be saying, you need to bring in someone who is legally qualified to do this. Again, the onus is on the interpreter to realize what their limits are. And when a counselor, a clinician, has an interpreter saying, I'm really good at this part, I can do the mental health setting, that's not a problem. But now we're moving into a category that is really not my expertise. We need to bring in someone else. Those professionals, those clinicians, those counselors, they need to listen to that interpreter and say, okay, thank you for being honest, and let us bring in the appropriate individual so that we can make sure that whatever is going to happen going forward is going to be in the best interest of that individual, that deaf individual. Does that make sense, Marlene?
I appreciate it. A great deal. And that brings us, I must say that I'm a registered nurse.
Thank you, Mary, thank you so much for that response. Also, thank you, Marlene, for bringing up that question. I would like to address just one more point related to that question. Oh, wait, we can't see you.
I'm sorry, I'm having an issue with my Zoom again. I think Christina will be able to highlight people in a second.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Let me wait on that for a second. Okay, can everyone see me now? Okay. All right. Marlene, I do want to thank you so much for bringing up those two great questions. And Mary Sue really explained a lot on one of the two. I would like to also respond to the other part of your question related to staff personnel working in a state agency or so forth, in any other form as an interpreter. So I did bring up from present legislation, it is on page 5. Now it's the same language. We are not changing the language. We are just renumbering and relettering based on additions that we've made. So on page 5, it does talk about staff interpreters. And that language says, this shall apply to individuals who receive compensation for provision of interpreting services and provision of interpreting services as part of their job duties. And the requirements of this section shall not apply to interpreters as of family and friends who are volunteering their services. And this is upon the request of the deaf, deafblind, or hard of hearing individual. Now, that first part of section H does talk about staff interpreters because interpreting services are part of their job duties. And so that means that they must comply or adhere to this legislation as interpreters. So it should, hopefully that answers that question that you posed. And also those who volunteer to interpret, or those who can do that based upon an individual's request. And if it is done on a volunteer or pro bono basis, based on the deaf, deafblind, hard of hearing person and their request. So in the hospital, you cannot ask for volunteer interpreting services. And the reason that is because we've known through many, many years of experience in other hospitals and other settings that they will automatically ask the hearing individual with the patient that is going to see the doctor for interpreting. And so they, as different agencies, will ask the patient to bring a family member or so forth. And so that obviously is the unethical part of it that we have addressed in current legislation. Now, in the present language, which was passed back in 2019, if it says that there are any volunteer interpreters, the reason we still have this in the picture is because of the request of the deafblind, deaf, or hard of hearing individual. That is, they may have a person that knows their dialect, their local signs, their accent, so to speak, or their style. And so they're more comfortable with that. So yes, as a state, we are requiring certain credentials be passed and met, but as the deaf individual, they do have that option to select someone that they feel more comfortable with. So there's different areas of accountability in regards to that. So that's why we have that clarification in the present law. And so I wanted to pull that up to make sure that I was able to answer your question, Marlene. Hopefully I did.
If I could add to that, as Harvey suggested, it is important that we be sensitive to the requests of the members of our deaf and hard of hearing and deafblind communities, that sometimes they will feel more comfortable with an interpreter that is maybe a family member or a friend who may, they feel understands them better. That is true. The reason why we said that must be done on a volunteer basis is because as professional interpreters, we are responsible for providing communication between all entities involved in that situation. We have an ethical standard that we must uphold. And if I am a family member, I am going to be more attuned to the deaf individual I'm there with, rather than the counselor or the police officer or the attorney, I'm going to be aligned with that deaf individual. And therefore, I should not be paid because I'm already there in support of them. So we wanted to make sure that hospitals, attorneys, everyone, they need to understand if somebody chooses to bring an interpreter with them, that's a family friend or whatever, there's no assurance on your part that you're getting a qualified interpreter. And therefore, you may want to have a second thought. You may want to bring in a professional interpreter yourself to make sure that you're getting the information correctly, and so that you are covering all bases on your part. So I just wanted to reiterate that that's the reason why those individuals are not to be paid. They are there as companions, friends, supporters of the deaf individual by their request. They are not, even though they may be a professional interpreter outside of that situation, that's fine. But they are not representing the interest of the agency or whatever. So I just want to make sure that that was clear. That's why we said it that way.
I agree with that. I'm inclined, obviously, to leave that in there. I think that's very important. Someone who's a friend or a family member, someone that you know well, and so forth, provides tremendous value, I think, in those settings. Words can be misinterpreted. We know that just from text messaging, right? So someone could say one word that you don't know, and the word could come from someone who's close to you, and it means something totally different. And I think that's important. And what you bring up is also important. As far as perhaps needing a professional interpreter in a certain situation. And I would think, first of all, the person who wants to bring along a volunteer interpreter, it's their right of choice to do so. However, I feel fairly comfortable in that setting that the individual would perhaps, let their friend or family member know that perhaps they're a little bit out of their league. Maybe that might be the exact term. But if you get into a setting where it's starts out as medical, and then this could all take place in a hospital setting quite easily, a medical setting, and then all of a sudden there's a little bit of a mental health aspect to it, and maybe that conversation is still okay, but then all of a sudden it gets into a legal matter, and that might be a place where the conversation could depart to the point where the individual is now at risk, right, or is exposed to some liability, and it can go on and on from there. So I think everyone generally is fine with the volunteer aspect of it, and I guess we leave people at their devices to do that responsibly and know when they're in over their heads. I don't know how we can police that, and unless we decide somewhere in the language that we want to find that there's a ceiling to the escalation. If it escalates to a certain point, then I think maybe for maybe mental health professionals or for law enforcement, that they would require that certain certification is in place for these interpreters, because I think that's very, very important. I especially in the mental health and the legal aspects. So thank you for clarifying that, Mary Sue. It's very important. Marlene, you still have your hand up. Is there something else that you wanted to share, or is your hand just still up?
Marlene, we cannot hear you. So I don't know if you have to unmute yourself. We can't see if you're talking because the camera.
Her hand is down now. Yeah, I think she took her hand. I think her answer is she took her hand down. I think that's the answer. So I'd like to go back, if I may, and talk about the licensing requirements and who's responsible. How do we, if we're going to continue to utilize interpreting services or interpreters from out of state, or as Mary Sue said, from companies that are nationwide, what do you propose? How do you, I mean, I have ideas as well, but you know, we can bring those in later. I want to hear from this group. You know, what is reasonable? What are you know, based on your concerns, how do we make sure, how do we police that these people, you know, are actually certified? Do we have them take tests here? Do we have them, you know, if we're going to have you here in this state, do we require that you must do certain things? You know, one of the things that I'm still working on is I'm trying to compare, you know, our interpreter standards for our state of Connecticut, you know, nationwide, to see where we're at. I suspect early on that, you know, we want the best of the best, and we want people to be trained as highly as possible. I think that's the trend that I see, but I haven't done enough research yet to be able to make that, you know, a bold enough statement to say that outright. You know, I would assume that we have that the federal government has weighed in on this, right? We have federal standards, I think, Mary Sue, that kind of floating around there, if you will.
The Americans with Disabilities Act uses the word qualified.
Yeah.
Does not use the word certified. Yeah. So it's up to individual states' interpretation of what qualification means. Here in Connecticut, we opted for national level certification. So we recognize the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, the National Association of the Deaf certification. But we also realized that we were in desperate need of qualified interpreters. Our pool of interpreters was way too small to be able to handle the amount of work that we had here in Connecticut, and especially when it came to deaf interpreters. And so because of that, that was why the certifications that were recognized from Massachusetts. So even though it is a Massachusetts Commission on the Deaf, it's not actually a certification. It's an acknowledgement of that individual has a certain skill level. So it's not actually a certification. Anyway, many of our interpreters, they may be actually living in Connecticut, but they actually may be living in Massachusetts or Rhode Island. It doesn't really matter. They just need to have been able to take that screening and get that endorsement from Massachusetts. Again, the bulk of the need was in the area of deaf interpreters. And so we have been able to expand our pool of qualified deaf interpreters. And I know Harvey spoke to that earlier. That's why that is going to be added as a credential that is accepted under medical and legal, because we do not have, in Connecticut, we only have a couple, and many of them, and actually they have other full-time jobs. And so they're not accessible to us when we need them in the courts or at the police stations or in the hospital. And so that's why we needed something that would allow us that opportunity to do that. But again, it goes back to what the work group decided, was that the responsibility needs to be put on the agency to understand who they are hiring and who they are sending to assignments, rather than trying to chase down individual interpreters, because you may not have the contact information for those interpreters. And the only recourse they really have is to contact the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf and say this person interpreted and they weren't qualified. But that's a very long, tedious process that is not really going to get any kind of result. If you go to an agency and you say to the agency, you know, the interpreter you sent the last time couldn't do the job. They weren't up to snuff. I want to make sure you send somebody the next time who can. I think that has a little bit more clout and a little bit more of an impact than trying to chase down individual interpreters.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts on that, a lot of language kind of running around in my head. So the low numbers are for the deaf interpreters, that are people who are deaf, hard of hearing or deafblind, right? That wish to get into the become interpreters. Is that correct?
A deaf interpreter is someone who has the background and the expertise to work with a wide range of deaf individuals who may have various linguistic differences that hearing interpreters may not have had a lot of experience with. So for a good example would be, we have deaf individuals who come here from other countries. As hearing interpreters, we may not have had a lot of experience working with individuals from another country who are not really adept at American Sign Language. And so we need, actually, it's actually the interpreter who needs the deaf interpreter, because we need them to be able to bridge that communication gap, because they have that breadth of experience and skill to be able to make sure that that message is getting across. And we just didn't have enough of those individuals here in Connecticut. And fortunately, there were quite a number in Massachusetts. And so when we opened that certification or that credential up to allow them, we were then able to provide more service, more accessible service to a wider range of deaf individuals here in Connecticut.
What do you, that's interesting. So, you know, this is just your opinion. Why do you believe that there's more qualified people in that area in Massachusetts than right here in Connecticut? Just your opinion. Not putting you on the spot, Mary Sue. Just throwing out. You're the one that
I think that, and I'm sure that Barbara and Jeff and Sandy and Harvey could address this better than I can, but I believe Massachusetts has a larger active deaf community. And so you see, many more deaf professionals in that area. And I just believe that there's more education. I think they just kind of naturally gravitate to larger urban settings where they're going to have that kind of interaction. But I'm going to let the real professionals respond.
I don't see any hands, Mary Sue.
Alvin, did Alvin have your hand raised
Yeah,
for a
Alvin.
moment? He did.
Mhm.
Susan Yankee has her hand. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. Did anyone want to spotlight me? Okay, great.
Yeah,
So
Alvin,
this
yeah.
is Alvin.
Yeah.
Now, Mary Sue is right about certified deaf interpreters, CDIs, we call them, here in Connecticut. Honestly, I believe it's a very small pool. I think deaf interpreters, we have only 8. Most of them are from Massachusetts, some in Connecticut. But again, the availability of those CDIs for services is not there because they are also full-time employees. So we are slim pickings, let's say.
What's the outreach, Alvin? I mean, I know you haven't been doing this too long yet, but is there what's the need? What's the need basis? How many? What do we see typically for need? I know.
Oh goodness. Honestly, I can't say numbers or what the need is in terms of that, but in terms of who is willing to interpret as a CDI, there's not many here in Connecticut. I can't answer that. And this is Jeff. I have my hand up.
Representative, we're also going to be talking about this at the October meeting about the workforce development in more of a fashion. So I know we have a lot to go through here today. I don't know if we want to sit on this for.
No, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds. And I was just curious if Alvin had an idea. If he said he was overwhelmed, that this is a need that is out there, it's realistic and it can't be fulfilled. And that's important because that goes back to the training and the licensing, the certification, and how we're going to make sure that people that come in from other states are qualified. So, Jeff Braven, you had your hand up.
Yes, and I don't want to belabor this too long, but in terms of interpreter certification here, as a deaf individual, some deaf individuals are just fine with a good qualified interpreter. Some deaf individuals would prefer a certified deaf interpreter. due to, again, just stylistic needs and communication needs. Here in Connecticut, we can have that training occur, but there's not a lot of interest right now within the state. So we need to market and recruit for these types of interpreters. We are not presently doing that. And so we do depend on out-of-state interpreters. And so it's also what our state is doing in terms of education and training.
Thank you for that. So going back to my earlier question, what are some of the ideas that this group has, as far as making sure that the interpreters that we get from out-of-state services are qualified and that they meet qualifications here in our state?
Representative, I think that Susan Yankee has some thoughts on that.
Susan's got her hand up. Susan Yankee, I'm sorry, they keep moving you around, Susan, so I didn't see you up in the corner. Thank you, Representative Comey, for that. Yes, Susan.
Thank you. Last name Yankee. I'm usually at the end of the line anyways. So I just had a question, and maybe Harvey or somebody could answer this. Has anyone ever put in a fine situation for people that do not follow the rules? And the reason I say this is because I know we've had multiple, I believe, ADA lawsuits over COVID with not having access in medical interpreters. And those are long and drawn out. And once they're over, it never seems like the problem is solved. And I thought maybe if there was a small fine for agencies that don't follow up, if that was possible. And the reason I say this is I was on tour years ago. We had 2 buses, same rules. They both had to stop for food. The singer's bus had no fines backing it up. The orchestra bus had fines. The orchestra bus would stop and we'd keep going. So I just want to let you know, sometimes even a small fine is enough to bring about change. And then maybe those fines could go into a pool for organizations who cannot afford interpreters, similar to our assistive technology loan program. Thank you. That was more problems than an answer. Sorry.
No, thank you for that. Yes, Harvey.
Yes, thank you very much for your excellent question. And also Susan Yankee for your comment and thoughts. I think this is always a problem. Let's talk about enforcement, right? So we realized recently that while I live here in Connecticut, I am here in this state, and I have been for 20 years, exactly 20 years, ladies and gentlemen, this year. Now, for the past 20 years, I will be honest, there has been no real enforcement within the state. That has been lacking. And that's been common knowledge for a long time, that in many areas, and I'm saying in many settings, violations galore. In regards to interpreters without registering in the state or without the proper certifications, providing services. And we, as best we can, try to provide that correction and feedback, but there hasn't been enforcement and there hasn't been improvement within the enforcement arena. So now, I guess the question is, where do the violations mostly occur? And I am sorry to say that it is in the educational setting. There are many school districts and many schools that do not follow this law. Now, I am not here to criticize or condemn them. I am just speaking as a professional educator myself in this role. I have taken on that hat. However, that is where there are so many violations occurring and have been over the past years. Now, to answer your excellent question, Representative Fusco, in terms of improving all of these different things, let me give you a little bit of background here in terms of why we have the abolishment of the group that was mentioned, a unit of interpreters under doors. Right. So we've decided to go the route of the registry of interpreters for the state of Connecticut. Prior to that, and I would say 2011, one legislator in his wisdom combined two agencies, which included the past commission of the deaf and hearing impaired. And those were the ones that provided services to the deaf and hard of hearing community within the state, which included interpreting services. Once that merge happened in 2011, an updated law was passed, and that became the Department of Rehabilitation Services. Now, we thought that things would improve with all of these services combining. However, that did not occur. The opposite did in fact happen, where there was declination. And so there was a lot of that happening, primarily due to just the poor financial situation in the state at that time and what we were facing. Okay, so there's the history, some of the background information. How do we plan to now improve this situation? So first, as I explained, the state goes through the registry route. We've decided to do that. And then we have the Department of Administrative Services, which handles those different contracts. They provide the authority, the authorization for vendors. I believe it's 6 or 7 that are named currently. Some of them are here within the state, but some of them, I would say maybe more than half, honestly, are from out of state agencies. So that explains why Mary Sue was talking about all of these interpreters getting calls from various out of state agencies and vendors asking them to onboard with their agency and sign up with them to provide services within the state that they are not located in. Now, the complaint process of interpreters is not like I've seen before. Now, I mentioned this in the last meeting. I would say back in August, also as well as back in March, when we had the meeting with Amber, one deaf individual who is very, very comparable, has good command of English language and ASL language, informed me that he went to a doctor's office recently and asked for an interpreter to be provided in advance. When he went to the doctor's office, he saw the interpreter, and the signing skills of that interpreter seemed to be very different. Having to ask the interpreter several times, can you please repeat that? Having to ask the doctor several times, can you please repeat that? Now, he asked many other deaf individuals at that time in terms of having the interpreters provide their interpreter credential card. Now, under the Department of Rehab Services, that was what was occurring, was we had the interpreter cards that we could ask for. Now, in June, interpreters get their registry card. And so now members of our deafblind, hard of hearing community are now asking to visibly see that card that says they are registered within the state of Connecticut as a qualified interpreter. Now, that passed back in 2017. We are now in 2021. So we're asking to see these Connecticut registry interpreter cards. And a lot of interpreters are stating, oh, I didn't know that there was a registry, or so forth and so on. And so the agencies are sending them to these assignments with no onus, with no accountability. And so that's why we wanted to ensure that the language was involved in this law. And that's page 6, section K. Hopefully that will resolve some of these problems, because now it is not under only DAS, but it's also going to be state agency approval, interpreter agency approval, because these interpreting agencies are under the venues of these state laws and everything. And so when we have the state agencies here within the state, if they have a contract to provide services and provide interpreters, they now have that accountability of ensuring that they are on that registry for the state and that they are qualified. So now that we are the Department of Administrative Services, DAS, they can now utilize this law once it passes and include it within their contract with different agencies that are becoming vendors for the state. And then those agencies can have that within their contract for the interpreters that onboard with them. So that's what we're hoping, that this ripple effect happens once this law is passed. And we are ensuring that appropriate and qualified interpreters are being provided for our deaf, blind, hard of hearing community. Hopefully that answers kind of all of the questions, and especially the one from Representative Fusco.
That is a lot. So we want to make sure that, so when the agencies come in contact with the state, we put them on notice that they're going to need these, they're going to need to be registered. Their interpreters need to be registered, and they're going to have to be, for lack of better terms, card carrying members. And they're going to have to, and members of your community, the deaf, blind, hard of hearing community, would want to see those cards before they get started. I don't think there's an issue with that. That to me doesn't seem like a problem. Perhaps it just hasn't, like you said, the language hasn't mandated it, currently. So that's something that we can add in there for sure. Of course, we'll talk to the appropriate people, but that seems like a good step in the right direction.
If I could just add briefly, this is Mary Sue. Two things. First of all, it's not DAS, it's ADS. All the alphabet soup. It's the Aging and Disability Services, not Department of Administrative Services. Too many initials. That was the first part. But the second part was in reference to Susan's question about a fine. We have tried over how many years? I can ask, Harvey and Barbara and Sandy. I mean, we're talking at least 8-10 years. We've been talking about there needs to be something, a slap on the wrist isn't going to do. I don't even know that a fine is necessarily going to do much unless it has a little bit of a bite to it. But we were told that under the previous doors and under current ADS, they don't have the ability to enforce a fine. So that in and of itself is a dilemma. The other part of it is that it also requires that people need to be educated ahead of time, as it goes back to what you said, Susan, people need to be educated ahead of time that there is a possibility of being fined if you do not comply with the current law as it is written. But again, doesn't seem that we have that power to do that.
So we'll ask the group, is there an appetite for making sure that interpreters from entities that are out of state, need to be qualified, we need to find some way to qualify them here in Connecticut. That's something we want to, because my problem that I always have in the back of my mind is, I get the sense from the advisory group, from sitting in meetings and so forth, that they're really they want the best of the best, and I totally understand that. I mean, the things that we're talking about here, we must make sure that the people who are interpreting are qualified to meet the needs of the individuals. I get that, and I don't want to paint it with a broader brush. I don't want to go backwards and say, well, we can get more people if we leave things, it's a little easier to obtain them. But I think, and certainly in circumstances where we're getting people out of state,
Excuse me, Representative Fusco, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. You stop.
Yeah, I know, and I'm not intentionally. Unfortunately, Zoom has been not my friend today. This is the third time it's frozen on me. And and Christina Penn is trying to get back on. So Rep Fusco, I had made you a co-host. If you could make Christina a host, she can get back to spotlighting people, and I will log off and hop on again. I'm sorry for the
don't do that until you walk me through, because I have not. This will be first time I would host. Can you tell me where that is?
Okay, so do you see Christina's name?
I do, Christina. Yes.
If you click on, I think it says more. There's an option to make co-host or host.
Sure, I got you.
In the list of participants.
Yeah, I've got her here.
If you hover over my name,
More, yeah, I've got you. Yeah, more.
there we go.
So you're in the meeting, so I'm not sure. I've got. You don't want me to put you in the waiting room because it seems like you're already there.
Nope, if you just hit more, it'll say make host. Do you see where it says make host?
I'm sorry for all this. Sorry for the problem. I do not have that on as part of my drop-down box.
Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to log off, and so it should make you the host, Rep Fusco, since I had made you the co-host, and then you should be able to make Christina a co-host. Well, but I'll be back as soon as I can.
Okay. Aha. So make you co-host.
Yes.
Got it. Now I've got it.
Oh, no, wrong person. If you hit Barbara.
I hit Christina. Hey, Barbara, you're a co-host now. Christina Penn, co-host, yes.
There we go. Thank you.
I'm a co-host. Well, all right. I do want to make a comment though. My hand is up whenever we get a chance.
Okay.
I don't know how to co-host, but I do want to make a comment. I wanted to quickly go back to the comment about the fines, that idea. You know, I'm wondering that if we were under a different agency, such as using the protection, would it be appropriate? I'm not necessarily looking at fines, but looking at protection. You know, you have licensures for mechanics, for plumbers, for all of these other fields of professions. And so I'm wondering if we would object to that. Are we limited in where we are now? Maybe I'm throwing this topic out too soon, but it's just for safeguarding as well as for protections, potentially doing licensure.
Jeff, would you like to comment on that?
Sure. I'll wait for someone to spot. There we go. All right. Thank you very much for that. I did want to answer the comment that Susan Yankee made. This discussion has been an ongoing discussion, honestly, longstanding discussion. Connecticut is a small state, so therefore we do have a smaller pool of interpreters. And in all honesty, within this state, the enforcement is fairly easy because if someone doesn't like an interpreter, they know how to spread that word and not use that interpreter. And therefore that interpreter can drown and be blacklisted rather quickly. In a larger state, interpreters can get by. So we are fairly good in terms of just our own internal enforcement, but there are some negative aspects to that as well. Another issue that was brought up is really the problem is not interpreters in general in the medical settings and so forth in general settings. That seems to have a pretty good handle on itself. Looking at who's around in the community, I would say the larger problem is, I'm sorry, I missed that, Anita. What was that? Educational interpreters, the educational violations that are occurring. They use teacher aides or other individuals that may know some signed words, but are not interpreters. That is a different process. So therefore, that is where the problem mainly occurs. And that is widespread out in school districts and schools where certified interpreters are definitely needed. So I think having some sort of enforcement or some type of protection within that field is one of the bigger problems we need to address. You know, focusing on enforcing, such as adding a fine, I'm not sure if that's going to be as effective in the state of Connecticut, but I think as we review different issues and complaints that have happened and how to resolve those and make those improvements, I think that would be a nice way to approach things since we are such a smaller state. That is just my viewpoint. I know that there are other opinions out there, I am sure. So there we are.
Harvey? Thank you, Jeff. I apologize. Thank you,
Yeah.
Jeff. Appreciate it.
Yeah. So we have finished with section 1. I did want to recognize Jim, who sent out an email via Heather just recently. Jim Acabellis proposed that some language be added talking about the document being distributed from Heather. He mentioned Monday evening, 7:08. So if you haven't had a chance to see that, but Jim, he did make that suggestion in the email. He said that B, which would be on page, let me double check, page 2, section B. He would like to add some language there, putting it mainly in the middle. And it was talking about having that list on the website, the Registry of Interpreters here, and then also the categories of the settings, which will be regularly updated, such as it is. And I actually thought that your suggestion, your language there, Jim, is really good. And I am completely on board with incorporating that into the amendments proposed. So we will put that into the draft document if everyone is good with that. And then I will send it out to you so that we can see what the present law states. And then we will include Jim's suggestion within the red letter changes for the amendments. But I really did want to thank you for that because it clarifies what that list and registry will look like.
I think it's a good idea. And of course, we'll obviously speak with Commissioner Porter about that. I'm sure she'll be amenable and we can get the details from her on how to maybe make that a little bit better as we go forward. Someone else had their hand up. Did Mary Sue, did you have your hand up? Where did you go? No. I see Jim, recognizing Jim.
Thank you. And thank you, Harvey. We are not wedded to the specific language that we have in here, but we're wedded to sort of the goal of having it categorized. If through the process somebody thinks that there is better statutory language to, or say it in a different way, we are wholly supportive of that. But we just wanted to add that in because it was something that we have been talking about with the Connecticut Association for the Deaf for several months. So, but we are not wedded to that specific language, but the goal of having the website list the interpreters by setting categories.
Great, thank you for that, Jim. It is 11:26, which means we have 4 minutes to our kind of our hard deadline. Is there anyone that wants to bring anything forward at this point? So what I'm going to ask you to do for the people here, if you have any additional thoughts or concerns or any ideas, please get them to Heather. I think she's been the central point of communication, and I like to keep that same moving forward so that she can disseminate the information to myself and Representative Comey and Representative Abercrombie. That's very important. I'm going to make a statement here that you're not going to be thrilled with, but it needs to be said, and I want to reiterate, because I know that, Harvey, I know that in section 2 we talked about it was to talk about the state interpreting standards. And as much as I know that this is going to be uncomfortable for you, I think it's important to reiterate that it's my understanding that at this point there's really no appetite on the state's behalf for this interpreting standards board to get rolling at this time. That doesn't mean in the future, we can't roll into that. But as of right now, the goal of this particular meeting was to identify the concerns on standards and so forth. That doesn't mean, however, that some of the things that are in that, because it's pretty comprehensive, and I can appreciate the work that was done in crafting this language and work done by the advisory board. I know that you've been looking to get that board reestablished for some time. But that doesn't mean, however, that there isn't some language within those pages of the board that we can somehow incorporate into the interpreter language, the standards language that we're going to try to put together. Okay, so it doesn't mean that it's not going to happen in the future. And I'll be very, very honest with you. If you can find legislators who you think can get an interpreting board across the line in February, you are more than welcome to try to do that. That is entirely up to you. But I think right now it's important. We've laid out a pretty good agenda for moving forward, and I think it's very, very important that we stay focused on that agenda so that we can get a good foundation set, so that in the future, that may become something again that the state can't deny us. So I just want to get that out there in the kindest, gentlest way as possible, so they can keep everyone apprised of the direction. Harvey, you had a comment.
Yes. I wanted to state that basically, I think we've had a really good discussion today. We've answered really good questions regarding the present legislation and the proposed amendments under Section 1. So I think we did pretty good. We did a pretty good job today. However, I do realize we didn't have time today to discuss the Interpreting Standards Board as proposed in Section 2. I will suggest that we devote some time to that discussion before we come back to our meeting in October, or discuss some mulling over during the October meeting. Because I know that Representative Abercrombie suggested that we meet with them in the past, back in March, and have a working group to discuss that. So I do think we do need to devote some time and take up that cross on the October 2nd or October meeting and have some time devoted to that.
Very good. Thank you for that, Harvey. And thank you for everyone today for joining in. I think it was very helpful. Hope Representative Comey in closing statements.
Thank you, Representative Fusco. Excellent meeting. I appreciate all the work that Harvey has done and all the folks to get some of the policies smoothed out. Thank you on that. For our next meeting will be on October 12th, I believe. And if I'm incorrect, Heather, let me know.
That is correct, Representative Covey.
Okay, thank you. Same time. And we're going to discuss our opportunities I think we have in the state to develop the workforce, to prepare students and engage with vocational and occupational and other colleges, educational settings, to really find some more resources for our community here. So we're going to hear from Interpreters and Translators, Inc., the president, Francesco Pagano, who has a business in the state in Glastonbury. And so if you have any ideas before that you want to send along, I've been reaching out to some colleges and we're doing some background work. So hopefully it's going to be an exciting conversation on October 12th.
Rep. Comey, may I also add that UConn is also going to have a professor presenting next month as well, and we're still working on other people who might be coming.
Fantastic, Heather. Thank you. I also am going to reach out to you about some Yale resources I just found. So
thank you.
All right, looking forward to that conversation, everyone. Thank you again, and be well, be safe.
Thank you all.